in the sciences, there we go, people in the sciences and people in the humanities gathering together around this text and being able to mutually enlighten each other's reflections and thought on this thinker that they had grown to love together. So Dante is the sort of thinker that attracts that sort of collaboration. And I just wanted to recognize that that was a natural part of what you just described, and that's one of the things that makes Dante worth studying. And the second thing that I wanted to just note by way of introduction, I foolishly, when we were landing the title of this talk, Dante and the Good Life, Happiness, Healing, and the Human Vocation, in my mind I was thinking, how fortuitous that these topics and these themes line up so directly with this letter that Pope Francis promulgated earlier this year. Now, here everybody is quoting this letter. I realized, oh, well, of course, it was an inspiration. This talk is coming out of the inspiration of that letter to some degree. So I guess I can skip over a lot of the stuff I would have said right at the start, talking about the importance of that letter and getting started on reflecting on Dante for this 700th year of his death, the 700th anniversary of his death. Since everybody else did quote that letter though, I figured I'll add one extra quote, a third quote from Pope Francis's Candor Lucis Aeternae that struck me as particularly pertinent and apropos for this evening. So Pope Francis says, Dante today does not wish merely to be read, commented on, studied, or analyzed. Rather, he asks to be heard and even to be imitated. He invites us to become his companions on the journey. Today, too, he wants to show us the route to happiness, the right path to live a fully human life, emerging from the dark forest in which we lose our bearings and the sense of our true worth. Dante's journey and his vision of life beyond death are not just a story to be told. They are more than an account of personal experience, however exceptional. His personal experience opens on to something more universal, something that we can tap into. So everybody is going to have their own reasons for engaging Dante, reading Dante, choosing to take an hour and a half out of their life in order to come to a lecture on Dante. Greg was talking about some of his first exposures to Dante in high school. I had not thought to sit down with him myself and to start trying to read him until I was a student at Seton Hall as a junior. And it wasn't while I was at Seton Hall, I was studying abroad for a semester in Rome. I took advantage of an opportunity to study abroad. And that just kind of made sense. You know, here you are in the heart of one of the hearts of Italian language and culture and spirituality, and the program that I was a part of had a copy of the Divine Comedy on the shelf. So I thought, what better place to get into Dante than here? So I started to read it. And like Dr. Greg was also saying, Inferno is great. Inferno is a great story because it's so morbid and dark and dramatic, and it feeds that itch in us that we have in order to look at car accidents when we pass them on the road. And that's what I describe the Inferno as, or that's what I compare the Inferno to. It's like watching a particularly terrible car accident where you know it's grotesque and you know you probably shouldn't be looking at it, but of course you're going to, because why wouldn't you? There's entertainment, weird, dark built into that. So that's what Inferno is. It's the car accident of his poetry. And Purgatorio, it's also exciting because it's not so far beyond that sense of the dramatic, some grotesque imagery, but it's becoming lighter, it's becoming purer, it's becoming more lovely. The problem with reading Dante is when you get through Inferno and Purgatorio, and then you start reading Paradiso. And that's what happened to me. I started reading Paradiso over spring break that year, and I got to the classic canto that just trips everybody up, which is Paradiso 2. It's right at the very start. You get to Paradiso 2, and all of a sudden, Dante and Beatrice, this girl he fell in love with when he was 9 years old in Florence, who's now his guide through the heavenly spheres of paradise, Dante and Beatrice are in the heaven of the moon, and Dante gets curious about why the moon has moon spots. And so the whole canto, or most of it, is given over to this very complex, very technical, very by our standards inaccurate scientifically disquisition lecture on why there are moon spots. And I'm reading this canto in a train thinking, this is absolutely terrible. If the rest of Paradiso is like this, there is no point in wasting that time and that energy. Plus, it's just not true. That's what I was saying to myself. This just isn't true. So why am I going to waste my time with this anymore? So I put it down, 2006. I said, there's no more here for me. But that's also kind of the trick that Dante plays on his readers. For people who come at his poetry, Dante wants everybody to be able to get through Inferno and through Purgatorio. But at the beginning of Paradiso, Dante explicitly says in the course of his poetry, what I'm about to say is not for everybody. As a matter of fact, most of you should probably walk away from reading what's next, because what follows this poetry of paradise, what follows is going to stretch your minds and your hearts and your ability to conceive what's possible for you and for other people. And that's not going to be for everybody. It can actually leave you lost. So he invites us to put his poetry down. And the way that he actually invites us to do that is by making his poetry different and complex and technical and giving you this kind of sour flavor in your mouth, which is what happened to me. I had that sour flavor because Dante wants us to have a little bit of that to convince us, do you really want to go through with this? And then I said, well, for now, no, we can put it down. And that was fine for 4 years. But it was really in the course of studying theology at that small, insignificant Midwest school in Indiana in the course of seminary that a theology professor of the Old Testament for a research project just encouraged me. It sounded out of the blue to do some sort of research comparing texts in our course with the Divine Comedy. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, that sounds out of the box, sounds like it could be fun. And that created the space that I needed in order to read the comedy, the Divine Comedy, all the way through in one sitting for the first time. And when I did that, when I forced myself over that hump of Paradiso 2, the rest of Paradiso just unfolded. It opened out into this imaginative and vibrant and very, at that time, exciting poetry of imagery and light and song and dance and music. And it was just compelling and captivating. And the way that people wrote about that was also beautiful and compelling and captivating. And so from there on out, I kind of found something that I said, I think I can give myself to this. I think this is worth thinking about in a very constructive way and in a constructive way with other people. So everybody, like I said, will have their own reasons for approaching this and their own histories with Dante. But I feel like it's also important for us to be able to put the brakes sometimes on the Dante enthusiasm. You know, you can read through that document, that apostolic letter that Pope Francis wrote and say, yeah, Dante, prophet of hope, poetry of desire, means to lead us through this human vocation to happiness in the vision of the love that's God. That's great, that's all positive. But not everything is positive about Dante. And so a question kind of comes up in my mind, you know, given all of our reasons for talking with him together here, are there bad reasons? Could there be bad reasons for reading Dante or thinking about Dante? And the answer that I came to that is maybe not bad reasons, but there are wrong ways or there are unhelpful ways that we can approach Dante and try to make use of him with each other. We can use Dante inappropriately in at least 2 ways. And the first of those ways is for us to read Dante, quote unquote, for delight. Now, I'll have to explain that. And Greg, am I going to be able, I don't know what things look like there. I know there's some people tagged into Zoom, but in terms of what people can see and hear of me there in person, if I shared a screen and showed some slides with pictures and text, is that going to make sense? Is that going to work? Okay, let me.
That should work fine.
Okay, right now it's disabled. So as long as you can fix that, I'll share something. And if you can't, that is fine. And we'll just move forward. But the first way that we can use Dante inappropriately is by reading him.
Okay, try it now.
Okay, quote unquote, for delight. In Italian, here we go, per diletto. Let's see, let's get started with this slideshow. Here we go. So one of the most famous scenes in the comedy, I mean, everybody will have read it because most people who have approached Dante have read at least the Inferno. And one of the most famous scenes in the entire comedy is Inferno 5, the second circle of hell, the circle of lust, where Dante meets these two famous sinners named Francesca and Paolo. And the fault that Francesca and Paolo make is by reading this love story together of Lancelot and Guinevere, one of the old legends, falling into an adulterous relationship with each other. And he says at one point in the course of this engagement with them that what they were doing when they were reading this love story that precipitated their own relationship was, quote unquote, reading for delight. And I'll read the whole scene, and I've quoted on the screen for you there kind of the key passage that I want to focus in on. So these are lines 109 to 42 in Inferno 5. Dante is speaking to Francesca. When I had heard these wounded souls, I bowed my head and kept it low until the poet Virgil finally asked me, "What are you brooding on?" When I could speak again, I answered, "Ah, how many sweet thoughts, how much desire drove these lovers to this sorrowful pass." Then turning to the lovers themselves, I spoke again. "Francesca, the suffering you endure moves me to weep in pity for your pain. But tell me this, in that time of sweet sighs, how, by what means did love grant to you the knowledge of your hesitant desires?" And she answered, "There is no greater sorrow than to recall a time of happiness in a time of misery." And this is something that your teacher knows. "But if you have so great a desire to learn what first made us fall in love, I'll tell it as one who weeps and tells. One day, we two were reading Per diletto, for delight, of love's mastery over Lancelot. We were alone. We suspected nothing. As we read the story, our eyes would meet and our faces pale at each other's glance. But at one point only did we taste defeat, when we read how the longed for smile was kissed, the smile of Guinevere by her lover. This man, with whom I keep eternal tryst now, trembling all over, placed his lips on mine. That book and its author were our Galahad, and that day we read not another line. While this spirit spoke, the one at her side wept with such piteous sound that my senses failed, and as if I had died, my body fell like a corpse to the ground." One of the medieval conventions for reading texts was precisely not to read them for delight. It was to read them for profit, for edification. The phrase per diletto, or the idea of reading for delight, implied that Francesca and Paolo were reading a text together in a way that was aimless and mindless and sensuous. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't leading them to anything greater. They were just wasting time with it in such a way that confirmed them in their own misdirected loves, and then led to a negative imitation of a text that was actually a moral tale against adultery. They used the text wrong. So Dante builds into this scene with Francesca and Paolo an idea that one can read texts inappropriately by reading them aimlessly, reading them mindlessly, reading them sensuously, quote unquote. This is what it means to read them just for pure pleasure, just for pure delight. And there are other points in the comedy where Dante warns us that that is exactly the sort of mentality that his text is in danger of attracting us to at times, to be so fascinated by it that we treat it like a car accident, something grotesque and wild, but also very compelling and captivating, and we don't want to take our eyes off of it, or we're listening to it for the wrong reasons. And I won't read the whole text because it would take too long, but there is a scene very deep down in hell in Inferno 30. It's at the very base of Dante's eighth circle. And he meets these two other sinners. One of them is called Master Adam, and the other is called Sinon. And they go at each other with just like these brutal invectives of abuse and insult and slander and shame, on and on and on for dozens and dozens of lines. Dante is listening to these two sinners, and the dialogue of the comedy is reporting the fight of these two frauds until Virgil has to break in and kind of, not literally, but smack Dante across the back of the head and say, if you keep listening to this nonsense, I'm going to have a real problem with you. And that's what you see here quoted on the screen. Virgil has to break Dante at points of the journey out of this compulsion to listen or to hear or to pay attention to his surroundings mindlessly, aimlessly, sensuously, quote unquote, for dark delight. And so there's a lesson kind of inbuilt with these two scenes saying one can also approach the comedy in this way that would not be helpful for the message that Dante is actually trying to communicate, which is that these are the sorts of things we have to be broken out of. These are the sorts of fascinations we have to ask forgiveness for. These are the sorts of things he's asking forgiveness for in his own ways. So that's one way. And the other way that we can probably use Dante unhelpfully or inappropriately is by reading him without taking a certain humble view or being humbly aware of the fact that Dante is also a limited person, a controversial figure in some of his own rights, and a man who is very aware that in certain ways he failed in his vocation to produce poetry and to act as a prophet in a way that can lead people to happiness as he wants. In some ways he fails at that because he recognizes he's a proud man. People read Dante, and a lot of the scholarship sometimes is starting to focus on the problematics of the ways that he represents women, the ways that he represents interreligious figures, the ways that he treats on issues and topics like suicide and sexuality and race and violence. And even if you're just not paying attention to those topics, I mean, you can just pick up Inferno, Purgatory, Paradiso. You can pick up a poem like Inferno and say, isn't a text like this just fundamentally problematic? How do you write poetry about hell where you are identifying people there, putting people there, and making these what sounds like eternal claims about how God has judged them? That's problematic. That should create some sort of hesitations like, well, what is Dante actually doing here? Is he trustworthy? Should I follow him? Anyway, I only raise it to say, I do think we should follow him, but we at least need to not throw ourselves head over heels in optimism for poetry that sometimes can call us up short and asks to call us up short in order to do what it wants to do for us. So here's a proposal for continuing to go forward with our time together. In the course of that apostolic letter that Pope Francis wrote, encouraging us to engage with Dante, especially this year, at one point, he's talking specifically to artists. And Dante is encouraging artists to take up Dante in their imaginations and their projects because they, he calls them, they are messengers of peace, freedom, and fraternity. That's Francis talking to artists. He says, you are messengers of peace, freedom, and fraternity. And we need messages like that, messengers like that, to work with material like Dante's in order to inspire people in our day as well, inspire them with the desires of their hearts. And I want to propose that what Dante has to say specifically to artists is something that can be applied equally well to our understanding of what a common universal human vocation entails. That there's something inbuilt with who we are all together as human beings, where we are in our own ways called to be messengers of peace, freedom, and fraternity. That's part of what it means to be human. And I want to suggest that that's something, an option, and an openness Dante's holding out to us that he proposes or treats through the ways that he thinks specifically about wrath. And that's kind of what I want to focus on in his poetry. The ways that his treatments of wrath help to bring these topics of peace, freedom, and fraternity together in a particular way. So that's kind of the trajectory for what's going forward. I am under no assumption that all of us who are here right now have the same working information about the Divine Comedy or about Dante's life and his background. So I thought that it would be good at this point to maybe offer some sort of brief primer on the structure of the Divine Comedy and how Dante has imagined, particularly hell and purgatory, to be morally configured. Because if we're going to focus on his treatments of wrath across the canticles, Inferno, Purgatory, Paradiso, then we're going to have to know where those sections fall within the scheme of the whole. So this is what Inferno and Purgatorio in particular look like. Inferno is loosely based, not perfectly based, in a way reconfiguratively based on an Aristotelian categorization of human fault and error, which in the Judeo-Christian tradition can also be recognized as sin, but doesn't require the Judeo-Christian tradition in order to recognize these are ways that the human mind and heart and spirit go wrong. And so the whole of hell are ways that just a person of sound reason can say, yeah, this is ways that human nature goes wrong. Usually people know to think of Dante's Hell in terms of 9 circles. I mean, I think everybody could probably say that, like Dante's Inferno has 9 circles. It does and it doesn't. It does have 9 circles. There's also a vestibule of hell that Dante puts a certain category of sinner that he calls the neutrals in that don't belong to the segment of 9. They're kind of like a 9 plus 1. So the 9 doesn't cover everything. But the 9 circles of hell are also not the most accurate way of subdividing Dante's experience as he goes down to the bottom of it all. Virgil, who is Dante's guide through hell, helps to Dante think of it more in terms of an Italian city of that time period. Hell is built as a city. So there's the parts of Inferno that are outside the city walls, and there are the parts of Inferno that are inside the city walls. And outside the city walls are the upper regions of hell. And these are where the less serious sins are punished. Sins of what Aristotle would call in his Nicomachean Ethics, incontinence. sins where the lower passions of the soul have not been acting and willing in right relationship to human reason. And so accepting the first circle of limbo, where Dante and that imagination of the time puts unbaptized babies and the virtuous pagans. These are the circles of lust, gluttony, greed, and wrath. So that's where we're going to find wrath. It's the bottom part of this upper part of hell. But those are the less serious sins. Still meriting hell, so they're still serious, right? But that's the upper part. Inside this city are where Dante focuses on sins that have to do with the misapplication of the mind and the intellect. And this is where Dante spends most of his time in the Inferno. The sixth circle of hell is a circle of heresy. The seventh circle of hell is a circle of violence, which is itself subdivided into three circles: violence against neighbor, violence against self, and violence against God himself. And then there are two circles at the very base of hell that are given over to sins of fraud. And you can just tell, like, this is the sin that really got like Dante angry, because he spends most of his time talking about fraud that can be committed against somebody that you don't know and therefore don't really owe anything to. That's the eighth circle. But then also fraud that's committed against people that you have or owe special love and trust to. Members of your family, member of your hometown, guests you have in your house, benefactors. And of course, that's where the very base of hell is, with Brutus, Cassius, and Judas, these traitors against benefactors, lords, God himself. So that's how Dante, or Dante acting through Virgil and Aristotle, has his conception of the Inferno. And one of the best things, really beautiful reflections on Dante's Inferno that's been written in the past 10 years. It's this book by a theologian out of Yale University, and it was written by, or published by Yale University Press, called Julian of Norwich Theologian. So it's a systematic treatment of theology in Julian of Norwich. But in the course of this, Dennis Turner also has some particularly moving and profound things to say about Dante and how Dante conceives of sin and salvation. And I want to quote one paragraph, which is a little bit long, but will be nothing but beneficial for our time together. So this is, I think, one of the best pieces that has been written on Dante's Hell in the past 10 years. And I offer it to you, I share it with you. Dante's Hell is not just a place of punishment inhabited by sinners. It's a place where sinners, by choice, inhabit their sins and live their lives structured by sin's distorted perceptions of love. That love they have to reject as being an invasion of some imagined personal space independent of God, as a violation of their personal freedom and autonomy. But this self-deceived self-affirmation shows up in the refusal of the damned to accept that there can be any narrative other than their own. For they deny, after all, that there is any divine comedy. The damned all have their own stories to tell, and Inferno tells them. Each of them, from Francesca to Ugolino down in Inferno 32, each of them know that those stories which they each tell of their fates recount not just why they were sent to hell in the first place, whatever their specific sins were, but also why they are held there without term in a condition of sinfulness. For the grip of hell on them is but the grip with which they hold on to their stories, without which they cannot imagine for themselves any other identity or reality. They need their stories. They need their own storytelling. And they need the misrepresentations of themselves that those stories tell. Hell is but the condition consequent upon their ultimate refusal to abandon that need. Hell, then, is the condition not of those who sinned. There are many in Dante's comedy who have sinned more grievously than Francesca and Paolo and are not in hell, but are either in purgatory or in paradise. Hell's not the condition for sinners. Hell is the condition of those who do not repent of their stories, who refuse the offer of their revision by divine love, and insist on living by means of the story that sin tells, the story of the attempt to achieve a self-made significance independently of the story of divine love. And you might even say that the free will defense is the philosophical rationalization of that story, which, because of their refusal to abandon it, holds the damned in their place in hell. Hell's the place for those who can represent their freedom narratively and choose it only insofar as that freedom stands in the relation of mutual exclusion with the universal and omnipotent sway of divine love. So like I said, that is a long quote. We could do a lecture just on parsing every little line of that. It's rich and worth reading the whole book, so I recommend it to you guys. But I offer that also as like a frame for understanding what Inferno is about. That's Inferno. Purgatorio is, contrary to Inferno, not so much based on an Aristotelian ethic, it's based on the Christian tradition of the deadly or capital sins, deadly capital vices in this case. So just as there are 7 deadly sins, pride, envy, avarice, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust, the 7, just as there are 7 of those, purgatory in Dante's imagination also has 7 terraces where each of those disorders are corrected. And they're subdivided among themselves in a particular way. Pride, envy, and avarice are the lower 3 terraces of purgatory, the first 3 that Dante has to cross, because they're the more serious. And they're the more serious because they're all expressions of a love. Every human action reduces to love in Dante's imagination. But when it comes to do with pride, envy, and anger, so here's where we're going to get wrath and purgatory. When it comes to these things, these are examples of love that have taken on evil objects. Love that's directed in some way against the good that one sees in one's neighbor. That's what makes them serious. So love can go wrong by having an evil object like this. Love can also go wrong by having good objects that one either pursues too slow or too sluggishly. And that's why the 4th terrace of purgatory is sloth. That's what sloth is about. But love can also be directed towards good things, genuinely good things that one grasps at and pursues too eagerly or without the right sort of measure. And so in Dante's imagination, this is what the problem with greed and gluttony and lust are. They're all going after things that are genuinely good when they're pursued in the right way and at the right times. And so purgatory is structured in order to focus on these things. At the top of purgatory is the Garden of Eden. At the base of purgatory are the shores and slopes where people who died not in good relationship with the church or deathbed conversions, they have to wait for a period of time on the lower shores and slopes of purgatory before they get started with their penance proper. But that's how purgatory compares with Inferno. There's also a different sort of structure in Paradiso, but I won't go into that so much right now. Between Inferno and Purgatorio, we can therefore identify 3 types of wrath that Dante works through in his moral imagination. There is a sinful type of wrath, and that's what we experience in this part of Inferno that I just walked us through. I'll quote for you the parts of wrath that Dante describes in Inferno 7, particularly because some of the Italian here is just absolutely fantastic for the sort of onomatopoeia, that's the right word for it, some of the onomatopoeic effects of the poetry. So I'll read the whole passage 100 to 30, and then I'll focus in on some particular parts. This is Dante crossing into the 5th circle of Inferno and talking about the nature of the punishment of wrath. We crossed the circle to its farther edge to a point above a boiling spring that spills and gathers in the creek of hell. The water was dark, dark as indigo, and walking alongside its murky flow, we descended by an uneven path. The sullen stream, when it has made its way to the bottom of the barren gray slopes, feeds into the marsh known as Styx. As I was standing there, my gaze intent, I saw mud-caked people in that morass, all of them naked and with looks of rage. They were beating each other, not just with their fists, but with their heads, their chests, their feet, and they tore each other apart with their own teeth. My good master said, "You see now, son, the souls of those whom wrath overcame." And I would also have you know for certain that under the swamp are people whose sighs make the water at the surface bubble, as you see wherever you turn your eyes. Stuck in the slime, they say, sullen and sad, we bore within ourselves a sluggish fog, while in the sweet air that the sun makes glad. Now we mourn like frogs in this black mire. This chant they gurgle deep in their throats, for they cannot speak the words entire. And so we circled the foul pond around, watching them swill the swampy water, and stepped between the dry and soggy ground until we came at last to the foot of a tower. That's how Dante chooses to represent sinful wrath in hell. Wrath that is a disorder of the passions, not so much a disorder of the intellect. Although wrath that is a disorder of the intellect expresses itself in the circle of violence against neighbor, which we're going to hear about in Inferno 12. But wrath isn't just a matter of sin. So in purgatory, there's also a terrace of wrath, and this is punishing wrath that's not a sin, but so much as a sinful disposition, or a vicious disposition to sin, a wrongly ordered love for the ill of one's neighbor because they have done you wrong and you have not been able to forgive them in some way. So wrath can be either sinful or vicious, or there's also a righteous form of wrath that we're not going to go too much into. But one's passions can also be perfected by the practice of the virtues, perfected in grace, perfected in glory. And when the passions are perfected in this way, one can also have a form of what could be considered righteous wrath. But I'm not going to focus so much on that because we need to keep on moving forward. The reason why I bring up this quote from Inferno 7 and Dante's representations of wrath is not because I think it says anything particularly profound in its own rights about a human vocation to what we were saying earlier of peace, freedom, and fraternity. In some general sense, the way that Dante talks about wrath, you could say, obviously, these things are breaking down. There's no relationship of peace, freedom, and fraternity among people who are characterized in this way. So I don't bring up Dante's treatment of wrath for this purpose. Rather, I bring it up because I found reading these passages in community to be a very dramatic and in some ways very dynamic reflection of how relationships of peace, freedom, and fraternity can come together around the reading of Dante together, and not just what Dante represents about wrath. So what I'm talking here in particular is a project that I conducted a couple of years ago when I was living and working in Pennsylvania. I had been given the opportunity as a priest to celebrate Mass at a local prison on weekends. And the chaplaincy staff at the prison was desperate at that time. They were saying, the staff at the prison was basically saying, like, the men here are just so hungry. They are starved for opportunities for intellectual engagement. So whatever you can offer, if anything, with your time, as far as that goes, the men would eat it up and we can find a way to do something with it. So I thought, well, I mean, if they're looking for things, you know, something that might be interesting to do would be to host a Dante reading group here at the prison. And if people wanted to read through the Divine Comedy as a piece of classic literature with each other and talk about its themes with each other and get some discussion going, if that's something they'd be interested in, I think I'd be interested in that. And so we tried to get it off the ground, and it just took off. It was very dynamic. And this is where the conversations with the group really started to take on a different and deeper and more profound tenor with each other. It's when we got down to Inferno 7 Inferno 8 and Inferno 9, where we're talking about wrath. That's where the men started to relate with the text in a deeper way and a more relational way. I remember one man in particular who happened to be a veteran of the Iraq War. We were reading through Inferno 9 with each other. And Inferno 9, we're still in wrath, but Virgil and Dante are at the gates of the entrance to what will be lower hell and the sixth circle. And they're trying to go forward, but they've got this army of demons that's blocking them and closing the gates to them and saying, you're not going to go any further. You're going to be stuck here forever. So Dante's nervous and Virgil's nervous, and nobody knows what's exactly is happening. And they have to wait for heavenly intervention to come and see them forward. So we were reading through this scene, and I ask at a certain point, like, what do you think is going through Dante's mind? Or like, what would you imagine that some of Dante's inner thoughts or inner dialogue going on here are? And this guy, the veteran of the Iraq War, said, this is what it feels like when you have to storm into a building behind your troop leader who you've always thought is invincible, and you see him get shot in the chest and fall backwards and realize for the first time that the person you've put your life in their hands is vulnerable and not invincible after all. And I just, stopped dead. What do you do? It was so real. It was such a real reflection on the question, or it touched into such actual experience that at certain points, as we continued with the reading group, I thought, is this actually safe, or is this helpful to be reading this sort of poetry together in a way that elicits or solicits so much intense experience, and what's actually going to happen with that? There was a man who we were reading Inferno 12 together, which is another circle having to do with anger and wrath and violence. And the people in Inferno 12, they're standing in a river of blood, and they're submerged to different depths in it, and the blood's boiling, and that's their punishment, depending on how violent they were in life. And I remember reading through this with them and feeling very, very uncomfortable. Like, I had forgotten how graphic this was. I wonder what they're going to do with this. But there was another man who piped up in our reflections and discussions saying, that is exactly the way that I felt when I was ... doing whatever it was that he had done in order to get into the prison. He was reflecting and saying, I didn't have the words or the images to make sense of an internal experience, but this is exactly what I experienced back then. A man, when we were reading Limbo together, said, this feeling of waiting, this feeling of holding, it's like what watching somebody languish with a life sentence in prison is like. That's what limbo is like, is to watch a friend of yours with a life sentence in prison just sit there and fade away because they've got no hope of getting out and no way to move forward. And these reflections just kept on compounding on themselves. And the reason why I say that this was actually helpful was because this is, or what wound up being helpful in the big picture, was that they were realizing that Dante, with his language and his images, was reflecting a depth of human experience from the inside out. Not as somebody who was projecting images onto other people, but they felt like their experience was being shown to them and interpreted from the inside out, but also in a way that was showing that it was going someplace and wasn't stuck in that internal experience. Rowan Williams, and some of the work that he's done on prison chaplaincy and theological reflection on prison chaplaincy, has spoken about this as a work of reconstructive memory and imagination. And I think that's kind of what the experience of these men was about. They were watching these experiences shown to them in imaginative ways, but also in ways that led them to believe, oh, but it doesn't stay put here. Whatever Dante is going to do with us, it's going to show us that there's a step forward with this for us, because we're here. We're reading this together. We're not going to stay put where these characters that we're meeting and talking to are staying put. And so in their own way, that became a message of reassurance. At the very base of Hell in Inferno 34, one guy did raise a very good question saying, you know, here we are, we've spent 34 cantos reading Inferno together, following Dante, and Dante climbs down Satan's shanks, comes out the other side, but that's fundamentally not true. How can we trust Dante? Because we know, or we're led to believe, hell by definition is a place that you don't get out of. But here Dante is saying that he got out of it, and you can too. But how is that possibly believable? And if Dante is just selling us a load, why should we believe that he has anything more to show us or anything more valuable to say? And frankly, I think that's a question that has to be left open and not answered directly. I feel like that's one of those problematics that we should allow us to accompany us through texts like this, and say, yeah, why are we choosing to trust Dante, if not that he's holding out a hope that exceeds our ability sometimes to hope for ourselves? And maybe there's some good news built into that. Maybe there's a possibility of happiness that still is open to us. And so I frame that experience as an example of how reflecting or reading Dante together in a group that is very troubled, lots of broken experience, lots of really interesting experience, an example of how there's a sort of fraternity, a sort of community, a type of peace, even a type of freedom that starts to come to bear by reading this stuff together. And so that's why I even bother with reading poetry of Wrath in Inferno, because I think it's saying something for us. I also want to say something about Wrath and Dante's representation of Wrath in Purgatorio. I don't have a clock on me for whatever reason. So Greg, how am I doing right now as far as time goes?
Hey, Chase, you're doing great. Maybe another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for Q&A left.
Perfect, perfect. All right, let's launch back into this. So in Purgatory, Wrath is the third terrace that Dante gets to after having climbed through the terrace of pride and climbed through the terrace of envy. The third terrace is given over to Wrath, Purgatorio 15, 16, and 17. And what makes the terrace of Wrath so important to the overall plan of the comedy is that this is the exact center of Dante's poetry. And the idea of the center, or the idea of the middle, has just absolute significance, absolute importance in Dante's imagination. You can think of the importance of how the very first tercet, the very first three lines of the comedy are Dante saying, and I'll quote it in the Italian, "Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita." It was in the middle of the journey of our life that I found myself through a lost wood, because the direct way had been lost. Here in the terraces of Wrath, we're also in the middle of the road of our journey through the comedy with Dante. Mary is at one point described as the middle of the Empyrean heaven at the end of Paradise. Satan is described as the middle of the universe because he holds the very center of the earth. God is described as a middle point in all of these circles of angelic song, dance, worship, and liturgy that is eternally revolving around him. So when something takes place at the middle of something in Dante's imagination, you have to pay very close attention to it. And the cantos of wrath, 15, 16, and 17, are the exact dead center of the comedy. And that's how Dante is letting us know that something significant is taking place here. The comedy is meant to be, I would argue, in its own way, a poetic analogy of the Trinity. It's a poetic representation, as far as that can be allowed, of oneness and threeness. And the way that Dante works this out is by writing this poem in 3 canticles, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, 3 canticles that are composed altogether of 100 cantos. Each canto is told in poetic chunks, tercets, 3 lines. Each line in a tercet has 11 syllables, so each tercet is composed of 33 syllables. The rhyme scheme for these cantos is what's known in Italian as terza rima, or third rhyme, ABA, BC, B, CDC, where the middle term of a rhyme is always looking backwards past the poetry it's already passed and looking forward to the poetry to come. The way that Dante mediates reflections on threeness and oneness through poetic structure lead us to believe that the comedy is meant to be read and appreciated as a poetic analogy of what it means to say that God is 3 and 1. And at the end of the comedy, Dante has a vision of what this 3 and 1 God is like. That's how the comedy concludes. Paradiso 33, this vision of God directly. And what does Dante see in the very middle of God at the culminant moment of his vision, but what he calls our human image, la nostra effigie, which means the incarnation, the union of humanity and divinity in the person of Jesus, or the second person of the Trinity. That's what it refers to primarily. But by saying at the very end of the comedy that his culminating vision in the very middle of God and the second person of the Trinity is our image depicted in divinity, Dante is referring both to the incarnation, but also to the way that our image is to be seen reflected in the incarnation. Dante is seeing Christ, Dante is seeing Beatrice, Dante is seeing himself, Dante is seeing us in a moment like this. And therefore, if that's what Dante sees in the middle of God, if the comedy itself is a poetic analogy for God, we can also expect its middle, Purgatorio 15, 16, and 17, to hold out to us a particular image of humanity, and one that's meant to get us thinking, this is my argument here, about being messengers of peace, freedom, and fraternity. The bulk of the narrative of Purgatorio 16, the 50th canto, is Dante meeting this character called Marco Lombardo. And Marco Lombardo and Dante are meeting each other in this cloud that is darker than the nights of hell itself. That's how Dante describes it. It's blacker than black can be. It's blacker than hell. But here are these two souls that encounter each other through hearing each other's voices. And Dante is asking this soul, who introduces himself as Marco Lombardo, to show him the way forward. Marco Lombardo says, just keep heading in this direction with Virgil as your guide, you'll make it there. And Dante then eventually says, before I take leave of you, I have a question. And Dante's question for Marco Lombardo is one that you could ask in any age of human history. You can ask it in our own, but it was something that was very pressing on him at that time. Why does it seem like things are going so bad in the world right now? That's the question that Dante just has burning on his heart on the terrace of wrath. Why does it seem like things are going so bad in the world? And Marco's response to Dante is basically twofold. He says, well, let's own up to things. It basically comes down to free will, and it comes down to ill guidance from your leaders. But by raising the theme of free will, Marco has a very interesting take about what it means to be free. His take on freedom is particularly significant. Marco Lombardo doesn't think that freedom, free will, free choice is simply a matter of not being constrained by some sort of external influence or internal predisposition. One can be entirely free while still being subject to external constraints and internal predispositions. Rather, what he says about freedom is that it is itself its own form of subjection. And here I'll point you to the first 3 lines on this screen. Marco Lombardo says to Dante, "You are free because you are subject to a greater power and a better nature, which creates within you the mind that is not in heaven's charge." Freedom is a subjection to greater power and better nature that creates out of its own happiness. So if we hear lines like this from Dante as meaning that our freedom stands in relation or some relation of mutual exclusion or competition with the universal and omnipotent sway of divine love that creates us, here I'm going back to some of the words that we heard from Dennis Turner. If we hear Dante's words as meaning that when we're free, we stand in some sort of competitive relationship to God, then we're hearing it the wrong way, or we're hearing it like somebody who's caught in their own circle of hell would hear it. What Dante is saying in this passage instead is to be free means to be created in the image and the likeness of a God who is happy, who loves us, and who gives us the essential ability to be delighted in things, to be moved and to move ourselves towards things that delight us, fundamentally because these things are a reflection of the God who first and foremost creates us by delighting in us. So freedom is for taking pleasure as our guide to life, which also entails being healed in our delights, such that our pleasure ceases to try to consume into itself those things that attract it or those things that it can covet, and starts instead to praise those things for the deeper satisfactions they promise in the pleasure of the one who has made us and made us for itself. That's a lot of words and it's very complicated, but this is what Francesca kind of gets wrong when she's reading this book for delight. She's just reading it on its own terms. She's not allowing it to be a reflection or a voice to her in its own way of the one who created her, the one who created her from its delight in her, and the one who created her in order to take authentic delight in other people, but as a reflection of the fact that God has made her and everyone else for himself as well. And the reason why wrath is a fitting context for discussing this or bringing up this type of freedom is because if you were to play this form of freedom out, what it would actually wind up looking like is what wrath gets most in the way of, which are acts of forgiveness, acts of peacemaking, and fundamentally the sort of merciful love that is revealed in the sort of cruciform life that Jesus shows on the cross. At least this is Dante's claim on the terraces of wrath. If you were to live your life in such a way that you followed your delights, but you followed them in a way where you allowed yourself to be educated in them, informed in them, and made stronger in them so that you weren't looking to consume things into yourself, but you were looking to take other people's good and other people's pleasure and other people's well-being more and more seriously at the same time. If you lived your life this way, then it would look like a life given almost entirely over to forgiveness, to peacemaking, and to the sort of cruciform life that one acts when they're acting mercifully towards other people. So for all of the things that are going on in wrath, for all of the heavy doctrinal statements that Dante is making in the center of Purgatory from Purgatorio 15 to 18, What's emerging in these cantos is an idea of human nature, I think, that we're all meant, or Dante's inviting us all to flesh out, which is an image of human nature in the words of Dorothy Day, or a title of her autobiography, her journals. Human nature is kind of its own duty of delight. It's the ability, or it's the call to hear oneself addressed at the very root of one's being by the delight that creates it and is calling it in this very moment into existence. And in hearing itself addressed like that, to freely learn how to take care of another's good, another's pleasure, and another's well-being as their own. That's what makes for peace. That's what makes for fraternity. That's what makes for freedom. And that's what I think Dante's trying to show us through these treatments of wrath and our reflections on the human vocation. So that is a lot of words. It ends on a pretty complex note, but why don't I just let that rest right there, create some free thinking space around it, and yeah, open it up to maybe some other questions. So thank you for that. I appreciate your attention.
Chase, Father Chase, if you share your screen, we can see the other people in the room, both here and there. So yeah, we have a few minutes here. I know it's getting late, especially for Father Chase, but we do have a few minutes for questions. So I'm sure Mark has one. If you're a student, you don't get credit if you don't ask a question, but we welcome them. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
I am working to unshare this screen, so you know.
Okay.
But, all right.
We don't see. I think if you just downsize your PowerPoint now, Father Chase, we can see you. There we go.
Can you see me now?
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
So I see Nancy unmuted too. So we'll start with Mark, and then I'll jump to Nancy here in the virtual space.
Nancy wants to go first, or I'll go first?
You go ahead, Mark.
Okay. A great presentation and great what you did in prison ministry with the economy.
Can you, sorry, Mark, is there one of these on your table? If you click it so it turns green, it'll just be better sound quality.
Got it. That's better? Okay. Great work on the prison ministry with Dante.